Hi, I'm Radine. Welcome to Life Sciences. Today's lesson is on human evolution, and we're going to have a look and unpack the topic for today. All right, so here we're going to have a look at, and one burning question for a lot of people is, did humans come out of Africa? So we have a look here on the board. We can see here's a map with the out of Africa hypothesis where they believe that humans evolved or came from Africa. So we're going to have a look at how the evolution took place and then where we went to. All right, so on this topic, we're going to have a look at the key concepts, which are very important. Terminology is key. We're going to have a look at the lines of evidence that we have. We're going to have a look at the various species that we have evidence of, and then we're going to have a look at evidence. We're going to look at other evidence other than fossil evidence. We're going to look at genetic evidence. We're going to look at cultural evidence. We're going to look at where the fossil sites are found in Africa. We're going to have a look at the Cradle of Humankind, and then we're going to have a look at the out of Africa hypothesis. Okay, so there's quite a lot to have a look at. All right, so let's start off with the key words. And as I've already mentioned, that terminology is key. And to understand the concepts and the content, we must know what the concepts or the key words or terms mean. So common ancestor is an ancestor that has two or more descendants that are common. Okay. Fossils, we know and we studied in grade 10, they are mineralized remains of organisms that have lived in the past. So all we have left is the actual fossilized remains. Extant, that's an important word, a term we use when we talk about organisms that are still in existence. So they still live or are alive, let's put it that way, are alive today. Okay, so those are species that we still find on Earth. Whereas those species that have disappeared, that are no longer found but only found in the fossil record, those organisms are known as extinct. So that is what extinction means. So it's the permanent disappearance of species from the earth. For example, the dinosaurs. They are no longer on Earth. We no longer have dinosaurs, but what we do find is in the fossil record, we find evidence that they did exist. Okay, then we're going to have a look at the term hominid and the term hominin. Okay, if we have a look at hominid, it's a group that includes modern humans. So we have humans in it, as well as all the human ancestors, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. Okay, and they are known then as the apes. And that is different to hominins. And if you can see here the spelling of the word, we have a D at the end there, whereas in this one we have an N. And that is a subgroup of the hominids. So it's a smaller group, and that includes only modern humans and early human ancestors. So when we include apes into the group, then we have to use the word hominid. When we exclude apes from the group, then we can use the term hominins. All right, Homo is the genus that we find that humans, or it is the genus that humans belong to, and that is a Latin term that means human. All right, and then the genus and the species of humans is Homo Sapiens, and it means wise human. So all humans today, so all extant species of human today belong to the same species, and that is known as Homo Sapiens. Right, then primates. When we did classification, we had a look. that it's a group of organisms. They are grouped together, and it includes lemurs, baboons, chimpanzees, apes, and humans. Paleontology is a term that we use when we talk about the study of, if we start looking at fossils and the fossil record, then we talk about paleontology because it's exactly that. It's the study of the fossil remains. Phylogenetic tree is a diagram that we find in evolution, and it's called a phylogenetic tree because we have the diagram represents phylum. So from the word philo, or from the part of the term philo, we see it means phylum group. So we see the different phyla that are related, and then genetic means it is relating to genes and origins. So that's basically what the tree represents. It shows the possible evolutionary relationships among different species. So we've got how we can see how closely or how far they are related. Right, so we're going to have a look specifically at human evolution, and we're going to have a look at how species changed, how they evolved, and eventually to what we have today, which is Homo sapiens. So basically, if we have a look at what actually drove human evolution, and we have seen that it's mainly climate change that was the driving force behind human evolution. Climate's always, it's always been a variable, and that causes organisms to adapt. Okay, so they could change. It depends on if the climate stays reasonably stable, then the changes would be slow. But where there's more rapid changes, in the climate changes drastically, we find much more rapid changes, and that would be because possibly there's a scarcity of resources, which then puts pressure on organisms. So we have a lot of competition amongst species for resources in a habitat due to whatever climatic change or environmental change that took place, and then those organisms need to adapt. And obviously those organisms or the populations that have more suitable changes or adaptations or characteristics, they would then survive. All right, so we know that hominins survived, or humans survived. They flourished, because of different characteristics or different reasons. The first one is that they were able to walk upright, so they were bipedal. So that was one of the reasons that they were able to flourish. Because remember when we said some of the advantages of bipedalism was that it freed up their hands, so they were able to manipulate things and handle things and carry things and pick and use. And the other thing is that the type of movement was far more energy efficient. All right. Then secondly, that their brain capacity was much larger, and that allowed them to develop forms of communication. So they were able to then communicate, they were able to talk, they were able to give instructions, they were able to, all those kind of communicate in a way that created a little bit more structure. All right, then they were also able to problem solve. So if they came across a problem, they would find a way. They developed tools, they developed weapons, they were able to control fire and things like that. All right, and then obviously to make the tools. Okay, so we can trace the development of hominins from the genus Ardopithecus. So that's where we're going to start. We'll have a look at Ardopithecus, and they lived about 5 million years ago, and all the way to Homo Sapiens, which are the only extant hominin species today. Okay, so those are the concepts that the key words or the key concepts that we've looked at. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll see you after that. Welcome back from the break. I hope you managed to stretch your legs. Okay, let's have a look at the next section of our work. Okay, so we're now going to have a look at our lines of evidence, and we're going to have a look specifically at the different human ancestors and the evolution. All right, so the first species that we need to look at is called Ardopificus Remedus. And what is important here is that you need to know the names of certain of these, well, actually all of them, but what you need to know is there's some detail, and what you'll see on some of the slides, there's a star that's been placed. And those species specifically, because they are quite sort of relevant for South Africa, for us, and they were discovered in South Africa, they are then starred, they are important, and examiners will use those examples to test you on. So you need to know the names and the genus and the species of the organism. You need to know where they were found. You need to know which scientist found them, and then you need to know a little bit about their characteristics. Okay, so let's have a look at the slide. Okay, so the first one is Ardopificus Remedus. We call him Ardi for short, and Ardi means ground, and Pithecus means ape, and Remed means roots. So that's where we got his name from. And they were discovered and it was found that they lived about 4 to 5 million years ago in Ethiopia, so they are in Africa. They were discovered by Tim White. And they have a very small brain capacity. So there you can see they only have between 300 and 350 cubic centimeters or milliliters, and their jaw is more prognathous. So if you have a look here at the diagram, you can see it's a much smaller cranium, and then their jaw is also still quite prognathous, which means it sticks out, protrudes quite far. So they've got a pointed face, and they have a very poorly developed chin. Right, they also still have a grasping big toe, and that is because they still lived in trees, or they used trees to, as part of their habitat, and so they were able to then swing from branch to branch. Okay, and their skeleton was adapted for bipedalism as well, so the pelvis was shorter and broader than the ape counterparts. Right, then the next species we're going to have a look at is called Australopithecus Animensis, and it means southern apes, and they were found in the lake area. They lived about 4.2 to 3.8 million years ago. They were also found in Eastern Africa. They were found by Mary Leakey in Kenya. Their brain size is also quite small, only 370 cc's. So you can see again their cranium gets quite flat. So that is an indication that they had a small brain. They also were bipedal, so they walked upright. Their ankle bone is pretty similar to that of humans, but they had long arms, and wrist bones indicate that they still used to climb in trees. Right, then the next species that we're going to have a look at, Australopithecus Efferensis, or we call the fossil has a nickname. Her name is Lucy. She lived about 3.9 to 2.8 million years ago, and was found in the region called Letoli in Tanzania. She was found by Donald Johanson. Her average brain capacity is about 430 cubic centimeters. So you can see it's slightly larger, but it's still not as developed as or as large as later Homo species. All right, they had a pronounced brow ridge. So here you can see this is the brow ridge if you look on the diagram, and you can see the brows are quite distinct. Even in this diagram you can see there's quite distinct brow ridges, okay, which is still characteristics of apes. They had quite a sloping forehead, and there you can see So we talk about a sloping forehead, so it goes in that direction, and that's because the jaw is still quite prognathous. Okay, so they had a flat nose, there was no chin, they were fully bipedal, so the foramen magnum was in a more forward position. Canines were also small, and they had long arms with curved fingers. All right, then Australopithecus Africanus. Okay, and there you can see our star. So this is a very important one. You need to study, you need to know all the features. They were discovered, it was discovered that they lived 3.2 to 2.1 million years ago. The face was prognathous, the jaw was prognathous. They had human-like teeth, so they were more human-like. They had a flatter face, also long arms. The average brain size was it's 428 to 625 cubic centimeters. The foramen magnum was in a more forward position, okay, which was an indication that they were bipedal. Examples are, and these are important, you need to know these examples, the Taung child, and that was found by Raymond Dart specifically in Taung. Mrs. Pless, this is another example, was found by Robert Broom, and then Littlefoot was found by Ron Clark. And yeah, so here if you can have a look and see, we've got a slightly larger cranium because we said that the brain capacity became a little bit more, it was a bit larger. All right, then we're going to have a look at Australopithecus Sediba. And again, here you can see we have a star, so this is another important one. She's named Karabu. You know, they named her, that's her nickname, if you like. And they discovered that this species lived about 1.95 million years ago. Okay, they had characteristics of both apes and humans, and they were found near the caves in Malapa in South Africa. Okay, and the fact that they had characteristics that were both human and apes means that they regarded as a transitional species. And remember when we spoke earlier about transitional species, we said that they have characteristics, so they're usually in the middle and they have characteristics of the species before them, the ancestor species, and the one that comes later. All right, they were discovered, or she was discovered by Lee Berger and Brett Eloff. And here we can see the brain size is also not very big. So it's 420 to 450 mils. So you can see that, again, there's not very much of a forehead there. They were also bipedal. They had small molars and long arms. So there you can see some of the characteristics that are human, and yet the brain size is smaller, which is it's a characteristic more of other primates. Okay, so the next group of organisms we're going to have a look at is Homo, and we're specifically going to look here at Homo Habilis. His nickname was Handy Man, and that was because he was the first where they found evidence of a species using tools and weapons and had ornaments and those kind of things. So they lived at about 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago, and they were found, the fossils were found in Tanzania by Mary and Louis Leakey. They discovered them. What they found is they have a less pronounced brow ridges, they have more human-like teeth, they have a flatter face. The average brain size was 650 milliliters, so it's getting slightly bigger. There was a less prognathous face than apes. They had long arms and they made stone tools. So here we can see, you know, the brain or the cranium is getting slightly larger. The face, the jaw here is less prognathous. So they were slightly more human-like than the previous species. All right, then we're going to have a look at Homo erectus. And Homo erectus lived about 1.89 to 11.11 or 11,000 years ago, 100,000 years. And they were first found in Indonesia. However, their brain capacity, you can see, is a bit larger. They have a sloping forehead. The nose and jaws were wide. They had a large face, no chin, thick brow ridges, no cranial ridges. So can you see that there's a mix of ape and human? So they've got a sloping forehead, which is more ape-like. The jaws are more ape-like because they're wide. There's no chin, which is more ape-like. There's thick brow ridges, which is ape-like, but there are no cranial ridges, which is human-like. They had a human-like body, and the proportions were more human, and they developed tools, weapons, and fire, and they cooked their food. Okay, so that was Homo erectus. Then if we have a look here, we've got another star. So this is another group that we need to study and know well, and that is Homo Naledi, and Naledi means star. They lived between 335,000 to 236,000 years ago. So they were a more recent species. They were found at the Cradle of Humankind, which is in South Africa, and they were found in a cave known as the Rising Star, and they were found by Professor Lee Berger, and he found there were about plus minus 15,000 fossils found in this cave. The brain size, again, is not very big. It is slightly larger than Australopithecus, but it's still only between 460 and 610 cubic centimeters. Their face was prognathous, so you can see they still had that protruding jaw. So if you have a look on the diagram here, but the slender body with wide hips, more human-like feet and hands, and they had long curved fingers. Right, then the next group that we're going to look at is known as Homo Neanderthalensis. They were discovered in 1829 in Germany, in the Neander Valley, and they lived about 200,000 to about 30,000 years ago in Europe. So that's also a much more recent species than what we've had a look at before. Now the brain size was much larger. Okay, and there you can see that they've got a much larger cranium. They had thick brow ridges. The nose was broad and large. They were short and muscular. They buried their dead, and they controlled fire. So they were able to use fire for whatever purpose, whether it was cooking or warming up or heating. They lived in caves. They lived in Europe, where it can get quite cold in winter. So they were then able to, and then also by controlling fire, besides cooking their food, so besides cooking and for heat, it also extended daylight hours. So heat to keep warm, and then to extend daylight hours. Okay, because then they used it as light as well. All right, and then we're going to come to the last group that is known as Homo Sapiens, and once again we have a star, so this is also very important that you learn. And we see that Homo Sapiens emerged about 200,000 years ago. Flores Bad Man was found by Dreyer in 1932 in the Free State. We also found examples at Makapansgat in Limpopo, in Border Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, in Blombos Cave in the Western Cape. The brain size was between 1,200 and 1,800 milliliters. They had a flat face, they had a defined chin, small teeth, a gently curved palate, rounded skull. They were bipedal, and they had shorter arms. And here in the diagram you can see very nicely where the cranial capacity is much greater. You can see there's a much larger forehead, and remember that's where the frontal lobe is, where your intelligence and your higher thinking and communication is situated. welcome back from the break. I hope you're ready to carry on with the lesson. Okay. Right, so we've had a look at the biological concepts. We've had a look at our lines of evidence, our different species. We're now going to have a look at the various forms of evidence that we have for human evolution. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have a look at fossil evidence. And if you have a look, we're going to talk about transitional species. Now, we've mentioned it in previous lessons, and we also mentioned it just a bit earlier, and we spoke about what a transitional species is. And here we see transitional species basically shows intermediate. So in other words, it's kind of the middle between two other genera or species. Okay, so they show intermediate characteristics. So if we have a look here at the diagram here, we can see over here we have dinosaurs, okay, and here we have the pigeon. All right, so our transitional species, so those are two different species, and our transitional species would be what we call, or what is known as, is Archaeopteryx. And Archaeopteryx was a fossil that was found in a lake in Germany. And what they discovered is that if you have a look at the structure of this bird, because it had feathers and it had wings, it's quite dinosaur-like if you have a look at the skeletal structure. Yet it had feathers and it had wings, which is more bird-like. And so we can see that it had characteristics that were similar or common to the bird. Okay, so it had those characteristics, as well as those characteristics that were common to reptiles. All right, because remember, dinosaurs were reptiles. So they've got claws, and they had scaly legs, so there were scales on the legs, there were claws, but yet there were also feathers and wings, which then was the common characteristics to both. So your transitional species then, as I said, has characteristics that are common to both the ancestor species, which in this case would be the dinosaurs, and the descendant species that follows, which in this case is the pigeon or the bird. All right, now let's have a look at the important fossil sites that we find in Africa. And again, I said to you that in the exams they will focus on those aspects in the topic that are relevant to South Africa and to Africa. So it's important that you know these, you know the difference, you know where they are, and then when you learn the different species, you know where they were specifically found. Okay, so we have a look at the sites in Africa more closely. A very important fossil or an area where we found lots and lots and lots of fossils is the Great Rift Valley, which is about a 2,000-kilometer geological feature across Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. Okay, so if we have a look here on the diagram there, you can see it's highlighted very nicely. So it's quite a large area, and it stretches over quite a few of the countries in Africa. So it has quite a few sites there. You can see there's Hadar and Middle Awash, Omo and Turkana, the Olduvai Gorge and Letoli. So that's where the Rift Valley, the Great Rift Valley then stretches across. Okay, so, and there were numerous fossil sites that were found in this Rift Valley. Right, then specifically in South Africa, we look at and we call it the Cradle of Humankind, and we know that the Cradle of Humankind has been declared a national heritage site. So it's very important that we preserve that area, and we look after the environment there. We look after all the findings, the cave sites that are there, And you saw because they're very rich in fossil evidence, and it's not only a national heritage site, it's actually an international heritage site. So from paleontologists, scientists, biologists from all over the world come here to actually study the fossils that have been found at the Cradle of Humankind. Okay, so and the Cradle of Humankind then basically has quite a few fossil sites, if you like, or caves, or areas where fossils have been found. And that's, if you have a look here on the diagram, you can see that part of Cradle of Humankind is Sterkfontein Caves, Swartkrans, Kromdraai, Plovers Lake, Gladys Vale Cave, and then Malapa and Drimmelen. Okay, now what's important is you'll notice there that most of those are either caves or they talk about Plovers Lake. Remember when we learnt about fossils and how fossils are formed, we said that mostly we find fossils that of organisms that either lived in bodies of water or fell into a body of water and they died there, and then their bodies then were fossilized, or their remains were fossilized. And that is why we find where there was previously water, or there is still water, then we find, in the rock layers, we find a rich source of fossils. Okay, so important to know then, in the Cradle of Humankind, we have the caves, or the area, Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, Kromdraai, Plovers Lake, Gladys Vale. And that's, we found, or in those areas, Australopithecus Africanus has been found, who lived about 3 million years ago, Homo Habilis, about 2 million years ago, Homo Erectus, Paranthropus robustus, which is also an Australopithecus, Australopithecine, and all of those fossils were found here. So we have a really rich source of fossil evidence. Okay, right, and then you can see that there are other areas. We said Blombos Cave is in the Western Cape, Classes River Cave, Sibudu Cave, Border Cave. Those are in other provinces as well. Right, then the next source of evidence that we find for human evolution is what we call genetic evidence. And here, what we do is we use the DNA that we find in mitochondria. So if we have a look in this diagram here, you'll see specifically it's mitochondrial DNA, which we find in the mitochondria. Okay, now the reason why we use mitochondrial DNA is because nuclear DNA, as you know, is a very large, very large molecule, and with many genes. I can't tell you how many thousands of genes, but it has a huge amount. So mitochondrial DNA is much shorter DNA, and it's actually easier. So then the mutations that occur in mitochondrial DNA happen quite a lot quicker than in nuclear DNA. Plus, we also know that mitochondrial DNA is passed down in the maternal line. So mitochondrial DNA is used, so it comes from the cell, and it's much simpler, as I said, than nuclear DNA, and it's used to study the ancestry of females, and that is because it is passed down from the mother. So mitochondrial DNA is passed down the maternal line. Okay, all right, and as I mentioned just now, that mutations would then take place much quicker than nuclear DNA. So this is why we use mitochondrial DNA. And please note that we abbreviate a mitochondrial DNA. We put an MT, so in other words, we write MT and then we write DNA if we abbreviate that. Okay. So that is what it is known as. Right, so mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA, it comes from the mother's ovum, which contains the mitochondria. When it's fertilized by the sperm cell, and it then becomes the zygote. So the mitochondria comes from the mother. So here we see, in this diagram here, we see the ovum with mitochondria. And when that is fertilized, remember when the sperm cell penetrates the ovum, all that goes in is actually the nucleus. So the head will then penetrate, and it's the nucleus of the sperm cell that fuses with the nucleus of the egg cell. So the rest of the cell that's going to form the zygote comes from the ovum. So therefore, it's the mitochondria that come from the ovum that actually then form the zygote, or the next generation. And here you can see, we know that the mitochondria are situated in the neck region of the sperm, and that part is discarded. So that does not fuse with the ovum. So that is why we know that the mitochondria then come from the mother's body or her cells. Okay, so the father's mitochondria, as we say, are not part of the zygote. All right. Here, if we have a look, what they've managed to do with the mitochondrial DNA, they've now discovered, or they've managed to trace that the mitochondrial DNA, they've managed to trace back all the way to an ancestor, a very early ancestor, the oldest female ancestor that they believe, and she comes from East Africa. So, and the way in which they discovered it, that is, they analyzed the mutations that they found in the mitochondrial DNA. And they then discovered that those mutations, there's a lot more mutations than in females that occur elsewhere in the world. So the females in Africa, and that's how they then determined that the earliest ancestor then is traced back to having originated in Africa. All right, so that's the mitochondrial DNA. Okay, then we have a look at cultural evidence. And cultural evidence is all the tools and the implements and the ornaments and the way in which species lived. So when they find fossils and they find a fossil site, they won't only just find fossilized bones, they would also find pieces of whatever clay pots and things like that were made, created. They'd find tools, they would find animal remains. So for example, skeletons of animals that might have been eaten by the species that lived in that site previously. So all of those things tell a big, they are a great contribution or a large contribution to the story of that species that lived there and how they lived. Okay, so we look specifically at cultural evidence and tool making, because we see that organisms started to use tools. They used stone tools for cutting and sawing. Okay, and what that did is, as soon as they were able to cut things, it then improved the nutrition. So now they were able to cut and they were able to eat animal flesh, so animal matter in not only plants. And as soon as that happened, it improved their nutrition, because we know that there's a lot more nutrients in animal tissue than there is in plant tissue. So it was definitely an improvement. Okay, development of stone tools became more sophisticated. So in other words, they weren't just basic. Here you can see in this picture here, you can see there's sort of a basic stone that they've kind of created a sharp edge. And then they became a little bit more sophisticated. So this one is a bit more elongated and has a sharper point at the top here. This one you can see is almost like an arrow shape, and it has been flattened out on these surfaces to make very sharp edges as well as a nice sharp point. And here this one too, and is even smaller and possibly easier to handle, would be easier to hold. All right, so when we have a look, and the reason why we look at tools is because we see that as they developed these tools, what it required was planning and thought. So it means that humans, their thought processing and the way they were thinking and planning was beginning to evolve, which actually is an indication that the brain capacity is increasing. All right, then we also find cave paintings as evidence of symbolic thought. And here we see that, we can see as time goes on, so this is the increasing complexity of the tools as time increases and goes closer to the present, and we can see how the tools actually changed. Okay. All right, that's all we have time for. We're going to take a short break, and we'll see you back after the break.
Thank you, Paleontology.
Welcome back from the break. I hope you're ready to carry on learning. It's very exciting information or topics that we are covering. So let's have a look. Okay, so we have had a look at our key concepts. We've had a look at the different human or ancestors or hominins. We've had a look at how they evolved. We looked at genetic evidence. We looked at fossil evidence. We looked at cultural evidence. We looked at the fossil sites. That's very important in Africa. We looked at the cradle of humankind, which you need to know. And now what we're going to look at specifically is the out of Africa hypothesis. Okay, so there are two different theories. The one is called a multi-regional theory, where they believe that humans emerged or evolved in different regions all over the world. And then there's the theory where there's a lot of evidence for it that we call the out of Africa hypothesis. And right at the beginning, when we started with evolution, we spoke about the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. And the out of Africa hypothesis then has quite a bit of evidence, and each time new fossils are discovered in Africa and elsewhere in the world, it actually adds to the evidence that we have for this hypothesis. All right, so the out of Africa hypothesis is basically an evolutionary theory of modern human origin. Okay, so that's important. It is of where humans came from. And what is important in this hypothesis is that you actually know what the hypothesis is. So that basically is a theory of human origins, of where we originated from. And then also you need to know the evidence that we have that supports this hypothesis. All right, so basically this theory suggests that modern humans originated in southeastern Africa and dispersed throughout the rest of the world, replacing existing human populations in Asia, which was Homo Erectus, and in Europe, which was Homo Neanderthalensis. And then the evidence suggests that modern humans, which are Homo Sapiens, left Africa somewhere between 120,000 and 60,000 years ago. Okay, so that is the hypothesis or the idea. And so now we look at, well, that's the theory, and that now we go and look at the evidence that supports that theory, that then makes it more accepted. Okay, so if we have a look at the map here, we can see, if we have a look, let's first have a look at the key over here in the corner. We can see all the areas that are colored in red, or the path there in red is Homo Sapiens. So that was where they came, where they were, and how they moved, where they started and where they moved from. And then we can see the more mustardy color, if you like, was Homo Neanderthalensis. Neanderthalensis, oopsie, was Homo Neanderthalensis, and then the yellow area was those that were where Homo erectus lived. All right, so if we have a look over here, we can see that this is where we've said, where we believe that humans, modern humans originated about 200,000 years ago, and they started to move north. So there you can see they moved northwards, going up into the other areas of Africa. And what happened there is, and remember we said at the beginning when we spoke about human evolution, and we said very often it was climate that caused human evolution or drove human evolution to take place. And so as soon as climate changes occur, then there would possibly be a change in the environment. It might have become drier, it might have become colder, there might have been a shortage of food, there would have been more pressure from predators, you know, so they would have had a lot of threat possibly from predators, and that then caused them to actually move and go and look for more habitable areas, and maybe where there's more food. All right, so we can see the red arrows. So once they'd gone into North Africa, they crossed over and then went into the Middle East, and then, so that was about 100,000 years ago, and then moved towards Africa, towards Europe from Africa, into spread out in Europe, there into the middle of the continent, and then down into India, and here into Siberia, that area, and then slowly on made their way down to Australia, New Zealand, and there you can see that's about 50,000 years ago, and here to New Zealand 1,500 years ago, and then carried on through Asia and moved across to the Americas about 15,000 years ago, down to South America, and so eventually humans were found all over, or Homo sapiens were found all over the world. All right, so let's have a look at the evidence for the out of Africa hypothesis, and very important is fossil evidence, and here we have to have a look at important wording, where we say Ardopithecus fossils were found in Africa only. They were found nowhere else in the world, and they lived about 4 to 5.5 million years ago. And then the second group is Australopithecus, and those fossils were also only found in Africa, and those are the examples. So only those fossils were only found in Africa, nowhere else in the world. Then the oldest fossils of Homo, so those of Homo Habilis and other bipedal organisms, were also found in Africa. Okay, and here we can see this is Homo Habilis, and then we also see that the oldest fossils of Homo Erectus, so in other words, those fossils of Homo Erectus found elsewhere in the world were a lot younger than the fossils of Homo Erectus that were found in Europe. All right, and then we've got here a phylogenetic tree showing the possible evolutionary relationship, and here we can see we've got Paranthropus Africanus, it gives rise to Australopithecus, and so we have the Homo groups that are emerge, and so we end up here at the top with Homo sapiens. Okay, well that's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed the lesson. I hope you took all the hints and the tips that are required for exam purposes, and we'll see you again next time.